Um, I was saying that this is a newly rechristened new avatar of the Women's History Roundtable series. And I welcome you all, especially because there are a lot of people who've come to a Pratnya program for the first time. The digital avatar allows us to include not just participants from everywhere, but to draw on our friends around the world and around India and around South Asia, which has never been possible before. Pratnya was never imagined as a hyperlocal, only by auto organization. And this really allows us to spread our wings. And we celebrate this new freedom by inviting Radhika Radhakrishnan to speak at our first session in this avatar. Radhika is based in Delhi, and I very efficiently had her bio up and ready, and it has fallen off my screen. But let me read it out to you. Radhika Radhakrishnan is a feminist researcher studying the intersections of gender, sexuality, technology, and politics. She currently works for the Internet Democracy Project and has a master's in women's studies from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. She tweets at @so_Radhika ! I should also say that the Internet Democracy Project is an old partner of Pratnya's. We worked together in 2013 on a digital security seminar that Anya Kovac came and spoke at. And we've also worked with Point of View, which has been a home to the Internet Democracy Project. So essentially, our first session of the Pratnya Gender Talks are a family affair, and we're most delighted that we can now engage with our family all over the world. So welcome, and I hope that you will mute yourselves. I will at this point. We are recording this. Radhika's presentation will be available online at our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/GritPrajna. We will send you a link at some point. But please mute your mics. I'm going to switch off my video. Questions can come in the chat room, partly because we are not so well versed with this platform that we think we can manage video questions efficiently. And there may be greater clarity in the connection if you're typing. So on that note, I think I've made all the announcements I need to. The series is generally on second Saturday every month. So stay tuned, stay in touch, and we will take the liberty of adding you to our mailing list. So Radhika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Swarna, for the introduction and also for having me on this webinar. I hope I'm going to do some justice to this being the first edition for this year. And let's see how it goes. I'm really happy to be able to give this presentation. It's based on research that we've just very recently concluded. So very happy also to see all the participants, and I'm hoping that your feedback on this presentation will also help me improve my work, and it's a good opportunity to engage with people because how research sometimes can just be you sitting in one place and working. So it's good to actually interact with people at the end of this. I just wanted to check first if you can actually hear me or if I need to keep my mic closer to myself.
Please raise your hand. I think there's a hand raising button somewhere, or let us know on chat if you can't hear. I think you're pretty audible, Radhika.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to maybe take around, I haven't really timed this before, but I'm hoping I'm going to take between 30 and 40 minutes to finish sort of saying all the things I wanted to speak about today. And then I'm looking forward to engaging with everybody and taking questions and seeing how we can sort of engage. If there are any questions I want to ask in the middle, you can just I'll ask them and you can probably respond on chat and I can read it out. Also, at any point, if you think that this becomes a little technical, or if there's anything that you're just absolutely not understanding and feel like that has to be clarified at that point before I move on, please feel free to ask it in the chat box, or to just sort of ping me on the chat box, because I don't know if I can see the hand raised option from my end. So please do use the chat box for that if possible. And I will mostly be keeping my video on through the talk, but there are some parts that I'd like to share my screen for, because there are some images or some quotes that I'd like to, have everyone read instead of me reading it out. So in those parts, I will share my screen and then switch it off again when I need to speak. So if that's okay, then I'll begin. So as I said, this talk is based on research at the Internet Democracy Project that I've recently concluded, and I'm in the process of writing the paper for. So I wanted to first, and it's about, of course, as the talk's title is called, it's about surveillance at the margins, and how the lived experiences of surveillance currently during COVID-19 are being observed for people in various locations. And before I really just even get into it, I wanted to get some initial thoughts from everyone on, where they're sort of placed in terms of this. So if you could just, put in like one word or a phrase into the chat box in terms of what do you think of when I say data. So is there anything that comes to your mind? What do we often hear when we're told this is data? Could you just maybe put in like one word that pops up on your head, so we can sort of take it from there. You can send the responses to everyone if you're comfortable, or you can just send them to me if you prefer that. Okay, so I'm reading out what I'm, you can also see it on the chat screen. I'm reading out what I'm seeing. So I've got privacy twice, evidence. Okay, anything else that comes to mind? Thoughts, okay. Research, all right. Okay, so the reason I'm asking the authentic, okay. So the reason I'm asking this is because there are some dominant notions of what data is, and we're trying to reframe that through this research. And this whole presentation is going to be about how that reframing takes place, and it's going to use the case study of COVID-19 for it, and we're going to look at how women specifically are experiencing surveillance to try to show this reframing and to show this shift. I'm also getting another response that says information that perceivedly has some use. I'm doing this because it was in quotes. Statistics, okay. So of course we can come up with like lots of terms for this. The starting point of this research was that we were hearing a lot, especially within policy circles, that data is a resource. It's a public good. It's like, I don't know how many of you heard this phrase, but it's nowadays going around a lot in some circles that data is the new oil. And, that really made us question that, is data really a resource? Is it something that we can think of as existing independently from our own bodies? Because that is the way policies today around data are framed, where any harm that occurs as a result of our data being violated is seen very different from the way harms would be envisioned if it was our own bodies that were violated. We take our bodies more seriously. So if there is a case of, violation of our our physical privacy, because privacy is a word that came up, we would not just we who would take it more seriously, you'd see companies taking it more seriously, you'd see platforms like online social media portals taking it more seriously. Whereas if there's a case of, let's say, online violence or harm to something that is our data, it's taken much less seriously than we would take our bodies. So this research is really to like investigate that and see how far that holds true. And if it doesn't, then how do we reframe that? So now, where does surveillance come into this whole picture, right? So what this research was trying to do is see how surveillance is a process of controlling people's bodies through their data. So we feminists have for a long time, now started talking about surveillance as a means to control people's bodies. And we're trying to add a new dimension to that by saying that this control nowadays, in a world that is so data-fied, is now increasingly being facilitated through the use of technology and through the use of data. And that's something we're seeing a lot, especially during COVID-19. So I'm going to use that case study. And we're going to look at the lives of specifically women, because historically we've seen that women's bodies are more controlled than those of other persons, but also looking at women as an intersectional category. So we're looking at women in various marginalizations. It could be Muslim women, Dalit women, trans queer women. So let's also try to keep that intersectionality in mind. So a very quick note on my my research methods, so that you know what it's built upon. This is something that started off as really just conversations. Swarna is one of the people that we spoke to, in fact, around when COVID had just the pandemic had just begun and we had no idea what was going on, around March or April, when we were really thinking, okay, we don't know if this is even a research project yet, but we want to really speak to people and we want to see what their experiences are during this pandemic. And it's at that point that we noticed that people had so much to say. People were going through, of course, so many difficulties. And we thought, okay, this is really something that needs to be looked into more, looked into in a more deep manner. So we then began doing more structured interviews. So I've done 25 interviews as part of this project, in Hindi as well as English, spread out across 4 months. And just some of the communities of people that I spoke to, which I think is important to mention, because often research can erase certain identities, and I want to make it very clear that this research is entirely based upon conversations with people, and everything that we've been able to understand today is because people have so candidly shared their experiences with us. So I've spoken to sex workers, trans queer persons, Muslim women, migrant laborers, gig workers, ASHA workers, working class people who were just experiencing something like drone surveillance, women's rights organizations, women's rights activists, organizations working with Adivasis, public health activists. So a lot of people who on the ground at a grassroots level were really working with people, and then people in many cases themselves who were experiencing a lot of this to the extent that I could connect with them. So we found, after speaking with a lot of these people, that what is happening during COVID-19 is that surveillance is really increasing control over bodies of people, and data was a key factor in the way that surveillance was being experienced and in the way that surveillance was being carried out. And while, dominantly within the field, what this is thought of is as a lot of people said, privacy violation, right? And that privacy is thought of as privacy of data. So it's my data that is being violated. But what we find is that when data is used to control people, it's not just the data privacy that is at stake, but it's something more fundamental. It's our bodily integrity, it's our autonomy, and it's our dignity as individuals that is at stake. And that is what this research tries to do, which is to try to put bodies of people back into the picture and back into the debate around data, to really see how harms of data are experienced by people. And we find that it's people at the margins who experience this a lot more than others, and who often face the brunt or the costs of this form of surveillance. So with all of these introductory remarks, I'll move on to the more substantive part of what this research is about. And what I'm going to do is talk about 3 different sites in which surveillance is currently being observed during COVID-19. And these 3 different spaces are: first is the space of the family. So within the home, how is surveillance happening? And second is at the level of the community. So in a more public space, when people are in groups, how is surveillance happening? And lastly, I look at the stakeholder of the state, which is between the state-citizen relationship, how is surveillance happening? And in each of these spaces, how are people who are often marginalized experiencing surveillance? We'll then talk about how all of these overlap, etc. So I'll move on to the first space of the family. And, we've heard a lot, everyone is hearing during COVID-19, that if we stay inside the house, then we're going to keep everyone else safe. If everyone else is inside the house, then we are going to be safe. So the home is really portrayed as a safe space, and what is outside the home is what is unsafe. But the experiences of women's lives during COVID undoes this language of safety that is being forwarded, and it brings in an angle of surveillance. And let's see how. I'm going to share my screen to show you a quote that might make this clearer, and also will be in the words of the people who have experienced this. So one second, I think you can see my chat screen. All right, so if you can see my screen here, all right, so I'm not going to read out every part of this, but feel free to read from the screen yourselves. I spoke to Bishakha Datta, who is the executive director of Point of View, and she was telling me about how within the space of the family, women are undergoing various forms of surveillance. So one of the things she said is that right now, because women are constantly in the proximity of their families, a lot of whom are abusive, women are facing very high levels of domestic violence. And when there is a lockdown and the only means of accessing any sort of help during when women are facing domestic violence is through their phones, because if you have to call a helpline number, you still need to use your phone, or if you need to contact anybody, you need to go online. So you require internet, you require the phone to access any kind of help. But it's not enough to just have a phone, because in a lot of families in India, what happens is that the phone is a shared resource. It's not that everyone has access to their own phones. So if women have to use a shared family phone to contact a helpline number to report a case of domestic violence, they're scared of doing that, because they feel like if I call a helpline and someone else, like my husband, takes the phone after this and uses it after me, they may see the number I have called and then I'll get into trouble for it. So women are unable to report because of this dynamic of people keeping an eye on their usage of technology and what is it that they're really accessing when they access the internet online. And this is not just something that women face. You also see, as you can see on the slides now, that for people who are trans queer, for example, we're hearing incidents where, because they don't have the privacy within the space of the home to make phone calls or to just communicate with people from their communities, people are being outed to their families, often to their families who don't actually know about the identities of the queer people in the house. They often live what is called a double lie and a double life, sorry. And as a result of this, people are getting into a lot of trouble within the space of the home, and the space of the home is not being at all a safe space, but it's being a very violent space. As feminists have always known that the home is a very violent space, but let's look at how this violence is playing out during COVID, and how, the use of technology is facilitating this violence. And then in the last case, you see the case of sex workers who usually have two separate SIM cards for their use. One is for their personal use and one is for their professional use. Now, during COVID, when they are staying at home and they are, within the confines of their shared family spaces, they are not able to use their phones freely to keep in touch with clients, to maintain contact with them, because their families will find out what they're doing. And it's, of course, a very stigmatized profession. So they're unable to continue their work, which is affecting their financial autonomy. It's affecting their ability to continue living a livelihood. So you see in all these cases how, I'm also going to stop sharing my screen now. Yeah, so you see in all these spaces how women, trans queer persons, sex workers, people at various different marginal locations along the axis of gender and interrelated identities, they are currently facing a lot of control and restrictions over their use of technology, which is having lots of very devastating consequences for them in their own lives. And now let's understand why, right? Why is it that there is so much control that is exerted upon the access that women have to mobile technologies, for example? For instance, we know that in a lot of communities in India, mobile phones have been banned at various points by Khap Panchayats and other community leaders. So what is really so harmful about women accessing technology on a very fundamental level? When we talk to people, we realize that there is a fear that if women access data online, if they access the information they can get when they go online, they will be liberated from the traditional grasp of patriarchal control. So data in that way is seen as an escape for women. It's seen as a way out for them from their traditional boundaries that usually keep them within their confines. So you see here, what happens is that controlling women's data is a way of controlling women's bodies, because in all of these cases, restricting the access of women to that technology is having very direct effects on the way they are experiencing their bodies, the movement of their bodies, and what they can autonomously, independently do in their lives. So when we start seeing these links, we then start questioning the kind of distinctions that are traditionally made between data and bodies, where, as I said right in the beginning, we see data as a form of resource. We see data as some kind of oil, or as something that is independent from our bodies, and it's simply just out there for human use, for human exploitation, for human consumption. But if you look at data in this way, the way we've seen in playing out in these examples, then we see that something else is happening here, because how can data be a resource if the control over data is experienced so intimately by people as control over their own bodies? So we have to broaden the way we think about data, and broaden the way we think about data harms, to go beyond just privacy, to go beyond the kinds of harms that policies currently recommend under data harms, and to put bodies back into the picture and say that this is not just about privacy. When a sex worker is unable to carry out her work because she is not able to contact the clients through her cell phone, that is a financial loss for her. That is loss over her financial autonomy. That's a part of her bodily autonomy, a part of her dignity, a part of her ability to continue a livelihood. So these are all very embodied experiences that are currently not captured through the way we very broadly think of data as a resource. So that is, within the space of the family. I want to now show how this plays out in other spaces, such as that we'll first talk about the community, and then we'll talk about the state. Because these forms of surveillance are observed in all of these spaces. They're different to an extent, but there are also a lot of links between all of them. So now let's move from the private space of what is the family to a more public space of the community. I'm again going to show you a poster for this. Okay, so if you can see the poster on the screen, this is something that was observed, put up in a lot of public spaces in Hyderabad. And it reads, warning, do not allow hijras near the shops, and save people from coronavirus hijras. This shows that there is a certain stigma that we already see is associated with COVID itself as a disease. But what is happening here, interestingly, is that the stigma of the disease is being transferred to entire communities. So it's not just coronavirus that is stigmatized. Through coronavirus, it is the bodies of a lot of marginalized people and communities that get stigmatized, in this case, the trans community. And what effect does this really have? So I've put out here a quote by Raina Roy, who is the director of Sambobna. And when I spoke to her, she told me about an incident where a lot of members in her apartment, there was a trans person who was COVID positive and had to be admitted to the hospital. And when a person completed the treatment and was going to come back to her family's house, it's at that point when her neighbors found out that, you know, she was not just had been COVID positive, but was in fact trans. And they began discriminating against her. They disallowed her from entering the house. They told her that they will not give entry to her inside the house. So you can see how the stigma can have very life-threatening and critical consequences, especially for marginalized people during COVID, right? And I've given here the example along the lines of sexuality, but you see this happening along various axes. So here you can see that there's a Kashmiri Muslim I spoke to, and she lives with her sister alone in a predominantly Hindu locality. And she said that there was a rumor that was spread in her locality that her sister, who was actually coming from somewhere within India back home, just when the lockdown was starting, but there was a rumor in her colony that her sister was coming from Dubai. And she said that, you know, she started fearing a mob attack on her house because people started spreading these false rumors that, you know, she's coming from Dubai and she's coming from outside the country and she might be COVID positive. And she said that, you know, lots of people in her locality were coming back from different parts of the country, from different places, but they were all Hindu and they were not being questioned in this way. And this kind of community, watching, as she says, we were always under the scanner. The moment we go out, our neighbors are always watching us. And she specifically says that that's because she felt that they were two women living alone. They were single, they were Muslim, they were Kashmiri. So you see how surveillance really, when it's the community that is surveilling each other, it's still not community surveilling each other. It's a dominant community surveilling a more marginalized community. And in the last example, we go back to something that Vishakha told us, which is that in her locality, domestic workers and drivers were not being allowed inside after a particular time. And this is in the early days of the lockdown, somewhere during March or April. And she said that, you know, what she was expecting to see back then and now something that we're actually seeing is that people are physically surveilling domestic workers. They're watching their actions. They're seeing whether they're being quote unquote hygienic. And now you're seeing how in a lot of these cases you have people from dominant communities, really watching over and being suspicious of, and there's like vigilante action almost happening with respect to people from more marginalized communities. And if you look at this scenario, now I want to introduce the element of data here. And what does data do to this kind of scenario is what you see on the screen, which is one example of data is through the use of apps. The state has released a lot of apps, such as on the left, you see what is called the COA app, was released by the government of Punjab, and it allows you to report mass gatherings. So if there are people assembled in a group somewhere, it encourages you to report that to the state. So in a way, it's encouraging communities to keep an eye on each other for the benefit of the state. And on the right, you see a screenshot from another app called the Raj COVID app, which is from the government of Rajasthan. And it's actually releasing the names and the phone numbers of patients who are deemed to be COVID positive in a particular locality. So you see, I'm going to stop sharing now so that you can. Yeah, so you see that in all of these cases, we already have surveillance that is being sorry, my screen seems to have gone away. 1 second. Yeah, so you already see that in a lot of these cases, surveillance was already happening. But what is data doing to this entire process? What data is doing is that it's making the surveillance a lot easier. So the apps are one example, but you see so many other examples. You see CCTVs being installed by resident welfare associations, where the CCTVs are being used to take a look at who is entering the buildings, who's leaving the buildings. And then you have these community WhatsApp groups where there's a bunch of people on it. And a lot of times they, broadcast the private details, like, the phone numbers, etc., of COVID positive people in that locality. So you see that there are a lot of such, the government itself is releasing public watch lists with names of people on it who may be COVID positive. And so you see in a lot of these cases, when data comes into the picture, this surveillance takes on a very heinous form. Also because this data is most likely to be in the hands of very powerful stakeholders within the community. So if you take the example of these smartphone apps, they are going to be most likely used by people who already have access to smartphones. If you look at CCTV footage from the CCTVs that have been installed by the residents' welfare associations, or RWAs, then you see that the footage from this is most likely to be available with the heads of the RWAs. And in each of these cases, it is the surveillance of the less privileged, so the more marginalized, by surveillance by people who are in positions of power. So there is a reproduction of inequalities that is happening, and that gaze is really being facilitated through the use of data. So I can anonymously sit behind my phone, report someone near me, and action may be taken against them with no accountability to me. So, that's how communities, more powerful communities, are keeping a tab, keeping an eye on less privileged communities. And this has, people are talking about this in, again, terms of data privacy, that, oh my God, my data is being leaked. But is that all that is happening here? Because when a domestic worker, for example, is not able to enter a particular building because there's a CCTV camera watching over her, there's something more than the privacy of the data or for images that's being collected. What's happening is that her body is being restricted from the kind of movement that she's entitled to, which means that it's affecting her on a more basic level, on a more fundamental level. We saw in all these quotes how, when we saw the case of the Kashmiri Muslims, the case of domestic workers, the case of the trans queer person, what was happening is that, their data was being used to control their bodily movements, which means that this is an issue that's also about our bodily integrity, about our autonomy, and about our dignity. And our data is not just some independent resource that's not connected to our bodies, and that governments and industry can just collect and make use of, but it's something so intimately connected to our physical bodies that that distinction that we traditionally make between data and bodies is falling apart and it's blurring. And therefore we need to broaden our conversations around this as well. Now if you look at so the family and the community as two spaces that we have seen so far, I want to quickly sort of, make a distinction before I move on to how the state is viewing surveillance. I want to make this distinction between why is it important to look at these various spaces? Are these just, different examples of the same thing that's going on? No, because for instance, within the space of the family, within the space of the community, we already know that people are not considered equal, right? There are power hierarchies that exist between people within a house, power hierarchies that exist between powerful communities and less powerful communities. And in a lot of cases, people negotiate with this kind of power, especially women. And women's lives have been testament to how women negotiate with the patriarchy in so many ways in order to gain some kind of concessions from their families, from their communities, which would otherwise not be accessible to them. So there is a scope for negotiating with the kind of power that we see within these spaces. But now when we look at the state and the citizen relationship, this power difference becomes a lot harder to question, because even though we accept that inequalities exist within families and communities, that sort of an inequality is not supposed to exist between the state and the citizen. Because according to the constitutional framework, all of us are supposed to be equal. According to the Ambedkarite vision of equality, even if people are not in practice equal, as a governing framework, we must accept equality as a metric. So what happens if under the gaze of surveillance, especially surveillance that's facilitated through data, we start becoming unequal in the eyes of the state as well? So what we see is that, and this should not be negotiable, right? We should be able to access our rights freely from the state without it having to be a question of negotiation. And I'm going to now take you to a few examples of how this plays out in the state, in the ambit of the state. So in the first example, you can, we have Aadhaar cards, or we have a lot of digital identity cards which are used by the government to identify who we are. But what is happening is that these identifiers have taken on such a large role that we require them in order to access a lot of benefits that have been, actually something that we're entitled to. So I'm again going to show you, I'm again going to share my screen to show you a quote. Okay, so as you can see here, all right, for Aadhaar cards become a really big problem when it comes to trans communities, because for a lot of trans persons, they don't have their preferred gender updated on their Aadhaar cards because they don't want to publicly be out to the world, and they're just out within their communities, for example. But especially during COVID, when all the access to social welfare, all kinds of benefits are dependent upon our Aadhaar cards, then what ends up happening is that our identity becomes the Aadhaar card. So here is an example of a person, of a trans person who was admitted to the wrong ward in a hospital because when they were COVID positive, because their preferred gender identity did not match the identity that was mentioned on their cards. And you see, in this case, what's happening is, as a trans person with their physical bodies, they are telling the state that this is my gender. But that is not enough for the state. It's not enough for our bodies to physically be present. There has to be some kind of authentication of those bodies through data. So we see that in terms of prioritization, the data takes a larger priority over and above our own physical bodies. And that is what happens when the use of data becomes, so prevalent in surveillance. And that makes us begin to question how bodies can even be separate from that kind of data, when our bodies have become so datafied that it's not even enough for our bodies to by themselves prove who they are. And then in another instance of drone surveillance, for example, you see that there was a Muslim nurse I spoke to who lived in Jharkhand, and she told me that one day she got a call during lockdown, and she had to go to her neighborhood to help with the delivery of for childbirth. And because there were drones constantly flying overhead, she was unable, she did go at the end of the day, but as you can see on the quote in the screen, she had to hide in the dark close to the footpaths and quietly walk to the house. And this is not a criminal. This is a person going out to do their jobs. And she's expressing that she felt scared. She felt afraid for, just carrying out her job to earn her livelihood. And so what you're seeing here is that earlier, what would have required the presence of a human, like a police officer, to be physically present for a bodily search, now what is happening is just the threat of our images being captured by drones overhead is enough for our bodies to be policed, to be governed, to be regulated, and our movements to be policed along with it. So it's not simply so the physical threshold that was previously present is no longer something that is necessary to govern our bodies. So and of course there are a lot of examples that we came across for this, but I'm going to not go into all of them due to the time constraints. But we see that in a lot of these cases, therefore, the distinctions between our bodies and data are really blurring. And it is not just the privacy of the data that is collected that is at stake, but it is our own lives. It is our lives as people and what we can do on a day-to-day basis that's being affected. So very quickly in the end, I'm just going to talk about how people are now responding to these kinds of surveillance, because we're seeing that people are experiencing surveillance, but to an extent people also do have agency. And how is it that they are using this agency to respond to these power structures? There are different kinds of responses that we're observing, but I'm going to take the example of resistance here. And it's not just that data has been central to surveillance, but data has also been central to the responses to surveillance during COVID, because a lot of protests have now moved online. If you don't have access to the internet or to a mobile phone or a computer, you can't even participate in the resistance to surveillance in a lot of cases, which means that the ways that we have been, and beyond that, we've seen how surveillance is taking place in multiple locations, right? In the family, in the community, and the state. It's not just how we earlier envisioned, how, Foucault or Orwell told us that there was one powerful entity and then that powerful entity was surveilling a mass of people. We see that that's no longer true. We see that there's surveillance happening from all different angles in so many different spaces. So if we have to resist that, we need to be able to come up with newer strategies right now. Because on one hand, the access to technology is also mediating these responses. But at the same time, what it's doing is it's making surveillance so ubiquitous that a lot of asymmetries are taking place. On one hand, there's a power asymmetry where individuals have very little control over how their bodies are being monitored, how their bodies are being controlled by those in power. And then there's a knowledge asymmetry, sorry, where individuals also don't really even know how they are being monitored and controlled. So how do you resist something that you don't even understand, you don't know much about, and often are not in not in a position to influence, because you often will belong to a marginalized community in order if you're facing the brunt of this kind of surveillance, as we're seeing through all the examples that I've shown you. So and also because during COVID, surveillance is being justified as something that's being done for the public good, for the good of the public, for the interest of public health. So it becomes harder to resist it because we're told it's a good thing. We said this is something that is good for you. So how do you resist these kinds of things? So we need to really think about new forms of resistances. I don't claim to have a solution to this, but I want to frame this as a new problem that is confronting all of us. Swarna, how much more time do I have to, can I go into one last bit, or I can also sort of respond to that through questions if we're up with time?
It would be good if you could wrap up so we'd get about 40 minutes of discussion.
Great. So
and people can start typing their questions into this chat screen too.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to take 2 minutes then to wrap up, and feel free to ask me questions on this as well. So, we were thinking that we were overwhelmed with the kind of experiences we were hearing and how people were finding it so difficult to even respond to it, that, we thought surveillance should have to be reimagined. We cannot continue the way it's been continuing so far, because some level of surveillance is required and is beneficial for controlling the pandemic. And surveillance has historically occurred for disease control. But what's different in COVID is that the use of data has been very central to this surveillance. And on one hand, technology is very helpful for us to imagine possibilities beyond our private spaces. But what happens when that technology turns back on us, when that technology is used to, in fact, control us and not liberate us? And I feel like it's these things that we need to reimagine. We need to see how in previous pandemics, care was an important aspect of the way surveillance was happening. When tuberculosis programs were implemented, there is surveillance even there, where patients have to take their medicines in front of ASHA workers, who monitor their, medicine intake. But here, the kind of surveillance that is happening is not even human-centered. There is no care. ASHA workers are facing violence on a day-to-day basis when they go for surveillance. So what happens is that when we rely so much, in conclusion, when we rely so much on technology, we lose that element of care. And that ties it back to what I began off with, which is that we think of technology as the solution, as the panacea to all problems, because we think of it still as a resource. We think of it as something that humans can manipulate and, use to their own benefit. But when we start looking at technology and data as something that is so embodied, as something that has such intimate connections with our own physical existence, then we start seeing that we can no longer think of it as something that can be manipulated, because we don't think of our bodies like that, do we? So that, and then when we start talking about bodies and these experiences, that's when we can start talking about care. And that's why we need to reshift and rethink the way we've traditionally been thinking around data, around policies around it, so that hopefully, this becomes a starting point to ensure that as human beings, our rights are guaranteed to us, our dignity, our bodily autonomy, our integrity are intact, and that these are respected even during pandemics like COVID-19. I will stop here and take questions or just discussions as you see fit.
Thank you so much, Radhika. This was, I think for many of us, different aspects of this were a revelation. And we're going to start making connections between things in ways that we may really not have thought of. So thank you so much for giving us such a stimulating start to this series.